Hey guys, I want you to consider the two groups that Jesus discusses at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the end of Matthew chapter 7. He describes one as being founded on the rock and the other one as being founded on the sand. And that when the storms come, there's one that has confidence that he's built his life or his house on a foundation that can stand up to the storm, and the other one washes away because there's only sand under their house. Right now, reality feels like sand under our feet. Things are so bizarre right now. I mean, how much confidence do you have in our economy right now? How much confidence do you have in your job? You know, the market has been really a roller coaster. It's projected that we're going to have maybe the highest unemployment very soon that we've ever had really in the history of the country. We're in the middle of a pandemic. How confident do you feel in your health? It's important to ask ourselves the important question, what have we really invested our lives in? In which things have we put our confidence? In which things have we put our hope? Because really the only things that we should put our hope in are things that we have confidence in, things that are reliable. And when we put our hope and we put our confidence in the things that are not reliable, the things that will let us down, it results in what we have a lot today, which is a lot of hopelessness, even among Christians. And I want to give you some thoughts to challenge you. Maybe you are a Christian, maybe you're feeling hopeless. I want to challenge you that you have every reason to keep hopeful. And that if you're not a Christian, I want to show you where you can find your hope. One of the more entertaining stories or episodes in the Bible is found in 1 Kings chapter 18, where Elijah, who's the prophet of God, has come face to face with the prophets of Baal. And he challenges them in verse 21. He says to them, how long will you go limping or faltering, the New King James says. How long will you go faltering between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people did not answer him a word. And this phrase, to go on faltering between two opinions, has the idea of maybe being paralyzed by decision, or maybe someone who's going back and forth and vacillating, or someone who is maybe standing at the religious buffet and they're kind of looking at all the options and they kind of haven't made up their mind yet. One of the best ways I've seen this described is the idea that it's someone who is straddling the fence. Now, the prophets of Baal, they stepped fully in the place of Baal as far as putting their confidence in him. They weren't straddling the fence here. And in verse 26, you find where they're preparing for the sacrifice, because the contest between Elijah and these prophets was that they would both prepare an altar and a sacrifice, and they would both call it to their respective gods to bring fire onto their sacrifice. And so in verse 26 it says that the prophets of Baal took the bull that was given them, they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. There was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep, must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. It didn't matter what they do. The one in whom they had put their confidence didn't exist. He was false. He was fake. Of course, Elijah, on the other hand, he prepares the altar. He even tells them, put water on top of the altar and the sacrifice, the wood, dig a trench around the altar, put water in that. He calls out to God. Fire comes down and consumes all of it, even consumes and burns up the water. And God is shown to be the one true God, the one who is worthy to have our confidence. There's a similar type of story in the book of Judges It happened earlier than this episode with Elijah. And in Judges chapter 6, the Lord tells Gideon to go and to destroy the wooden idol of Baal. And he goes, and because he's afraid, he goes and he does it in the middle of the night. And so those who were Baal worshipers, they found the next morning, they found where the altar and the statue of Baal had been destroyed and another altar to God had been set up in its place. And so they go to Gideon's father, Joash, and they tell him, they say, bring out your son that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal? Will you fight for him? The idea of fighting for a God who can't fight for himself. He says, will you save him? It's bizarre, the idea of serving a God that you would have to save rather than a God saving you. He says, whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a God, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. And so the new name of Gideon was a name that mocked Baal as a false god who couldn't even stand up for himself, couldn't fight his own fight. You see, the peoples of the land of Canaan, they shook in fear because of what they heard about the God of Israel coming out of Egypt and really laying waste to and showing that the idols of the Egyptians, the false gods, that they were nothing, defeating them one by one. All of the people of the world that knew what was going on, they knew that this was a God who was a true God and not a God that they needed to fight for. You have this line kind of drawn of distinction between the false gods and the true gods, and some questions in Jeremiah 14, verse 22. Are there any among the false gods of the nations that can bring rain? In other words, can these false gods, can they bring rain and prosperity and make our crops grow? Or can the heavens give showers? And then he says, are you not he, O Lord our God? He says, aren't you the only one that can do this? We set our hope on you, for you do all these things. We have a similar point of distinction that Paul makes in the New Testament. The church, as it was being established, was the gospel was going into the cities and hearts of people who were steeped in pagan idolatry. And one of their customs was, as they would make a sacrifice to their false gods, that they would eat some of the meat offered to that as part of their service. And so some of the new Christians didn't want to do that. It offended their conscience to eat that meat offered to the idol. And Paul says, don't encourage someone to do something that goes against their conscience. But he wanted to mold their conscience with truth. And so he instructs them in 1 Corinthians 8. He says, as to the eating of meat offered to idols, he says, the English Standard Version says, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. The New King James says, we know that an idol is nothing in the world and that there is no other God but one. Have that same line of distinction drawn. And because of the two really worldviews, the two places that an individual could stand, one on the sand and one on the rock, then what came with that is this understanding, as Paul will describe, that when you're not a Christian, you have no reason to be hopeful about anything, especially what happens after this life. And that the things of this life can be like water that washes the sand out from under your feet, and then you're hopeless. But the Christians, on the other hand, they have every reason to be hopeful, especially for what happens after this life. And that when the rains come of difficulty in this life, that we don't have sand under our feet. We have confidence because we're on the rock. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13, when talking about understanding the reality of those who have already died, he says, I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. See, Christians are not supposed to be hopeless, especially not in time of death. When a Christian dies, it is a time where we have a confidence in the promises of God because he has shown himself to be faithful. In Ephesians 2 and verse 12, in describing the before and after of someone becoming a Christian, He says, remember that you were at that time separated from God, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. Those who are without God, they have no hope. Because without God, anything that they have invested in, put their confidence in, hoped in, is going to let them down. You think about how many things we're tempted to put our confidence in, how many things that we are tempted to really invest in, whether it's our job or our money or our health or even our family. And not that I mean that we should not take care of our families. What I mean is to make our family and our family's maybe worldview and our family's traditions a priority over spiritual things. Maybe we put our confidence in our friends. At this time, especially in our nation's history right now, there's a big temptation to put our confidence in the government to help us. And as we see historically, governments typically let their people down. Probably what we most have a temptation to put our hope in is ourselves. And it's a really sobering thought to think and ask the question, have you ever let anybody down? Have you ever let yourself down? It's very simple exercise to figure out I don't need to be hoping in myself. How many of us have had friends or family or health or a job or the government or money or anything other than God let us down? We've all had that. And so we need to be careful. We need to ask ourselves and test ourselves when we begin to invest and put our hope in something else. Paul tells Timothy, 2 Timothy 2:13, he says if we are faithless or unfaithful, when we let down God, he says that the Lord remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. The very essence and nature of God is one that means that he is incapable of not making good on his promises. Any promise that Jesus makes, he absolutely will uphold that promise. And he has shown himself trustworthy to do that. He has shown himself worthy of putting our confidence in him and of investing in him. There's a beautiful description of the reputation of the church in Thessalonica, where Paul is describing to them the reputation that has gone out to all the brotherhood. In 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 9 and following, this is how he describes them. This is a beautiful thing. He says, you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. And they turned from hopelessness to hope. A life of hope is a life that is described in this way, waiting for his Son from heaven. That's what a true life of hope is every day waking up and saying, I hope today's the day. I hope today's the day. There isn't anything that can happen today that can take away the hope of the day when he comes and takes us home. And all of that is based on this undergirding of solid rock theology, really. Peter describes this or spells this out in 1 Peter 1, starting in verse 3. Why do we have a hope? What is our foundation, really? 1 Peter 1 and verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who, by God's power, are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire. And make no mistake, we're in a time of testing. We're in a time of being tried by fire. May we be, as he's saying that they should be, he says, may you be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Jesus is described as the light that shines in the darkness. The darkness does not comprehend it, John chapter 1. Because anywhere that you look other than Jesus, you see darkness and hopelessness. And we, as we shine the light of Christ, we are to show the world the hope that's in Christ. We're to show them the light. Jesus, really in his final charge to his apostles and to us, gives us the confidence. On the night that he was betrayed, right before they went out to the garden, right before he prayed with them, the last verse of John 16, he tells them, he says, the things that I'm telling you so that you'll have peace. He says, you're going to have tribulation, you're going to have difficulty. They were going to have it that night. They were going to have it throughout their lives. And he tells them, you're going to have this difficulty. He says, but take heart or be encouraged. I have overcome the world. When we put our confidence in anything but Jesus, then we put our confidence in things that can be overcome, rather in the one who overcomes. The things that will be sand under our feet, rather than the rock under our feet. Are you on the fence? Have you made the mistake of investing only partially in Jesus and in other things as well? Do you feel like you have sand under your feet right now? You know, when Peter was called out onto the water by Jesus, he had his eyes on Jesus, and he could do what he could only do by the power of Jesus, have solid ground under his feet. But then when he began to look around and was distracted, he began to lose his hope. He began to see that his situation was hopeless. There's no way that he can make it. He began to sink. Maybe you feel hopeless like that. Maybe you feel like you're sinking right now. I would encourage you to do what Peter did. Call out to Jesus. Reach out your hand and take the hand of Christ.